One of the biggest improvements in SharePoint 2013 is the offloading of a couple of very important, very big components. And the reason that these components have been offloaded is so that way we can better share these between other services and also give us the flexibility to be able to update them without having to update the SharePoint farm as well. And that's what we're going to take a look at in this lesson of external SharePoint components. In particular, the two big components that we're going to take a look at are our Office web apps, which as we're going to see will enable editing of Office documents through a browser, and then the Workflow Manager, which will give us the ability to offload the workflow processing. But let's start off by taking a look at our Office web apps. Office web apps, for those of you that are not familiar, gives us the ability to do web-based editing of our Office documents. And that's going to include Word documents, Excel, PowerPoint, and OneNote. Really, what this is an in-house version of what Microsoft makes available through both Office 365 and SkyDrive. That on both of those services, what I can do is actually edit Office documents with a tool no more powerful than a browser. And that's exactly what my Office web apps gives to me, is that capability, the ability to view and edit those documents without needing Office installed. Now, one little side note that I want to mention right away, as far as licensing goes, is that if you do want to edit documents, you do still need an Office license. So Office web apps is not going to free you up from needing your Office licenses. The server itself, the Office web app server, is free and can actually be used with SharePoint Foundation, which of course is the free version of SharePoint. However, you do still need Office licensing. Some of the cool features that come along with Office web apps include the ability to do change tracking. This is actually new to 2013. So that way I can actually enable change tracking, do that through the browser, and be able to see that actually in my local Office document or through the browser as well. We have the ability to add in comments. We now also have the ability to co-author for all applications. In the past, this was limited to just a couple of Office products. Now we can do co-authoring with all four of the supported Office products: Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and OneNote. Which means that I can actually have multiple users. I can have two users that are editing the same spreadsheet or the same PowerPoint document at the same time. And then finally, last but not least, is built-in support for quick preview for search. That when I mouse over a document, what you're going to notice is that I'll get a nifty little pop-out, fly-out, that will show me what that document looks like. And all of that is because of the magic of Office web apps. Now, the big thing that you're going to notice about your Office web apps is that this does require a separate installation on a separate farm. Now, the nice part about this is that it separates Office web apps from SharePoint, meaning that I can have multiple SharePoint farms or even actually exchange point at that one centralized Office web apps implementation. Additionally, it gives me the ability to upgrade SharePoint or to upgrade my Office web apps on a different schedule. That in the past, they were tied together. If I wanted a new version of Office web apps, I'm having to upgrade SharePoint as well. Now, I can actually have separate farm with Office web apps, be able to upgrade that or upgrade SharePoint as needed for each service independently. Now, in order to set up and configure my Office web apps, there's a whole host of different things that need to be done. I do need to enable claims-based authentication for every web application that's going to use Office web apps. Classic mode is not supported. As I mentioned before, for licensing, if I'm just simply looking to view the documents, I can do that for free. But if I'm wanting to edit the documents, I do need to have Office licensing through the volume licensing from Microsoft. And then I also need a couple of bits of software installed on the Office web app server as well, including the .NET Framework 4.5, Windows PowerShell, and I need the web server component, or IIS, installed as well. Let's turn our attention to doing the installation. To do the installation, what I'm going to need first up is a web app server that's going to be all set and ready to go. I'm going to need to configure the different Windows services on there. The easiest way to do that is through PowerShell, just so that way in one PowerShell commandlet, I can just add on all the needed features, one reboot, and away I go. I could also do this through the wizard as well, but I'd much rather do this through PowerShell. Just going to make my life a little bit easier. Then I need to, of course, install the Office web app server, which you can obtain from Microsoft. Again, that software is freely available. And if I'm wanting to do editing, that's when I'm going to need the licensing for the clients, that they will need an Office license. If I'm going to be using language packs, I will need to install those. Again, that's optional. If you're just working in what Mark Manassi likes to call Defaultia, which is US English, then you're not going to need the language packs. And then we need to set up the server farm, and we're going to do this through PowerShell by calling the new Office Web Apps Farm commandlet. Now, if I want to enable editing, which is disabled by default it's just simply read-only, then what I need to do is specify the editing enabled switch when I make the call to the new Office Web Apps Farm. Once I set up the Office Web Apps Farm, then I need to configure SharePoint to use it. To configure SharePoint to use it, what I'm going to need is a server binding. And by the way, this can only be done through PowerShell. Then I need to create a WAPI zone, which stands for Web Application Open Platform Interface. And again, that can only be done through PowerShell. Once I set up my server binding and the zone, then I'm able to do my viewing and my editing of my documents. Now, for our demonstration, I've already done a couple of things for our application server and our SharePoint server. On the application server, I already have the certificate installed, and I already have the services installed. And that's just going to make life a little bit easier. On the SharePoint server, I've already created a web application and a site collection, and it's available at intranet2013.geektrainer.com. I've also enabled SSL. One of the big things about the Office Web App Server is that the default for communication, which is actually a good thing, is SSL, and it requires SSL from start to finish, from back to front. So I'm going to need SSL enabled on the web application that's going to be using the Office Web Apps, as well as on the Office Web App Server as well, which is why I have the certificates set up. So I've already got my certificate services, and I've already got my certificate installed on the application server and on the SharePoint server. And again, like I mentioned, I've already enabled SSL. Let's take a look at how to do the install and the setup of our Office Web Apps. I'm going to connect to my app server here. And on the app server, I already have my Office Web Apps connected here. So I'm just going to double click on the little DVD, put my little check next to accept, and hit continue. Then it's going to ask me where it is that I want to install it to. I'm just going to leave it with the default, and I'm going to click install now. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit close And now I've got my installation already done. Now what I need to do is fire up PowerShell here. And from inside of here, it's going to be new Office Web Apps Farm. Now what this is going to want is it's going to want the internal URL that I'm going to use, which in my case is just simply going to be https://app server. It's going to want my external URL, and in this case that's going to be https://appserver.geektrainer.com. That's going to be the one that I want the outside to connect to. And then it's going to want to know my certificate name. Now, the certificate name is required if I'm going to be doing any form of SSL. And if I go to IIS here, what you're going to notice is on my server certificates, I already have a certificate installed. And you'll notice that it's named appserver.geektrainer.com. So I just need to make sure that I tell the PowerShell commandlet that that's the certificate name. So appserver.geektrainer.com, and I'm going to enable editing. So now, a real quick character turn. It's then going to ask me, hey, are you sure you want to enable editing here? You do need licenses. So I'm just simply going to say yes, which is the default. Hit enter, and then let this provision the farm. And now, once that's been provisioned, it will then respond out and give me all of the basic information about the farm that I have just created. Now, if I want to go in and test to make sure that the farm has actually been set up, then what I can do is fire up Internet Explorer, and I'm going to navigate to https://appserver.geektrainer.com, and then in this case it'll be /hosting/discovery. Hit enter. And then what you're going to notice is the first little tag right up top there, that WAPI-discovery, that tells me that this has been set up and we're all set and ready to go on the server side. So again, run the installer, and then it's new Office Web Apps Farm, your internal URL, your external URL, the name of the certificate, and whether or not you want editing enabled. Now it's time to set up our SharePoint farm. So I'm going to kick over to my SharePoint server. I'm going to bring up the SharePoint 2013 management shell. And I'm going to say new SP WAPI binding, my server name, and this is going to be appserver.geektrainer.com. And hit enter. And now what you're going to notice is it will just simply display out everything for all of my documents and the connection for my external HTTPS. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to confirm the zone to make sure that it is in fact using HTTPS, and I can do that by saying get SPWOPI zone, hit enter, external HTTPS. That's exactly what I wanted to see. So now I've got the connection from SharePoint to my Office Web Apps farm. Now let me fire up Internet Explorer and let's test this. And I'm going to navigate to https://intranet2013.geektrainer.com. And when I hit my little plus next to new document, you'll notice that I've got all my different document types. Let's go ahead and choose Excel here. We'll give this a name. I'm very creative, so I'm just going to call it Demo. and I'm going to click OK. And now what you're going to notice is that this will open up my spreadsheet not inside of Excel, but rather inside of my browser. In fact, one of the biggest things that you'll notice is that when you set up Office Web Apps, that now becomes the default for editing your Office documents. And this sort of keeps pointing in the direction that Microsoft is really trying to go, which is a lot less local install and a lot more work done on the cloud. You'll also notice, by the way, that if you do decide that you want to open this up inside of Excel, that you do have Open in Excel as well. So there is how to install our Office server, how to create the connection, and then finally, how to test to make sure that everything works. Now let's turn our attention to workflow services. Sharepoint makes a fantastic workflow host. In fact, this is one of the biggest uses for SharePoint. So if I need to manage things like accounts payable, accounts receivable, if I need to manage things like onboarding of a new employee, making sure that they've talked to the appropriate people in human resources, have been issued their laptop, that their laptop has been set up correctly, and all the other steps that a new employee has to go through, if I'm trying to manage maybe something as simple as time off requests, SharePoint makes a great platform for all of that. But the problem, however, with workflows is that they can have a fair amount of overhead. That depending on exactly what it is that my workflow needs to do, what external services it is that it's needing to connect to, I may not want SharePoint to be responsible for managing all of that as well. So I want SharePoint to be the host, I want SharePoint to be the front end for my workflows, but I don't necessarily want SharePoint doing all of the work. This is where workflow services comes into play. Workflow services, very similar to our Office Web Apps, gives us the ability to create a separate farm for managing our workflows. That way, A, we can offload the performance overhead of managing our workflows to another farm, but also B, we can better allow for integration between other applications, or even just simply set up the one farm, optimize that, and then every single environment that's going to be using workflows of any shape or variety can then use that one centralized farm, be it SharePoint, Web Services, ASP.NET, or anything else that needs to use workflows. Now, in order to set up our workflows, the first thing that we're going to need to do, of course, is to install the Workflow Manager. And you'll notice that you can download that from the URL provided right there. The next step is to set up our certificates. Once again, Microsoft wants to use HTTPS for communications between our SharePoint farm and a backend farm that's going to be providing a service. Now, we can, of course, set up certificates in one of two ways. Either A, we can use a self-signed certificate. Now, if we're going to use a self-signed certificate, then what we'll need to do is export that and import that onto all of our web front-end servers. A better setup is to set up certificate services inside of your domain and then configure IIS on the app server to use that certificate. That way, I don't have to put the self-signed certificate onto all the other web front-end servers. They can just simply accept the certificate that was issued to the app server from the application services that we already trust. And then, of course, after we set up the backend, then we need to go into SharePoint and register the workflow service and tell SharePoint where to offload its workflow services to. Once we register it, then we have to make sure that we install the Workflow Manager client, and that does need to be performed on each web front-end server. And you'll notice it's the exact same URL to download the client as well. To make the demo roll a little bit smoother, I've already set up a couple of different prerequisites on our demo machines. I've already installed on the SharePoint farm the app management service and the user profile service. The app management service is needed to allow SharePoint to actually connect to the workflow services. Setting up this service application is actually very easy. Just go back into Central Administration, just create a brand new app management service, and that's it. The default installation will actually work just fine. The user profile service, this actually takes quite a bit more work. I've already done the setup so that way we could do this lesson, but we are going to go back in a different lesson and take a look at how to set up, configure, and manage that user profile service. On the certificate front, I've already set up one for our web front-end server, and I've set up one for our application server. Now, I've already installed it, but you are going to notice I will have to go back to the website inside of IIS and configure it to use that certificate. And then finally, on the SharePoint server, I've already installed SharePoint Designer. That's going to allow us to test our workflow. And I've already installed the Workflow Manager client just because, well, it's just a normal kind of next install. So I've already done that for us. So let's get in, take a look at how to set up the back end and how to set up the front end for our workflow services. Let's take a look at doing the setup first on our app server. I'm going to connect to my app server, and I've already downloaded the Workflow Manager executable here. So all I have to do is just double click on this, and then simply hit install. And we'll just kind of walk through the defaults there and hit continue. And let this download all the appropriate components. And so now that we've got it installed, once I hit finish, it will then launch my configuration wizard. I'm going to hit next on the default, and I'm going to go ahead and choose SQL 2012 primary.geektrainer.com as my server. And then for the service account, I'm going to use geektrainer/app services, which is just a normal domain account that I've created. And I'm going to set up my super duper top secret password. You'll notice that I can choose whether or not I want to allow for HTTP. The default is HTTPS, which is exactly what I want to do. It'll also automatically open up the appropriate port on the firewall for me, which will make my life that much easier. And then what you're going to notice is that it's going to ask me for the generation key, certificate generation key. This is going to be needed every time that we want to add a new computer to the farm. I'm just going to use kind of my typical password here for demo machines. And I'm going to hit next. Now what this is going to do is this is going to give me a summary here of all the different things that it's going to do. You're going to notice that I can copy that information, and you'll also notice down towards the bottom that there's a Get PowerShell Commands link. Personally, I always have a lot more luck with the PowerShell than I do with the wizard. That quite frequently I find that when I run the wizard, it just bombs out. But if I do the PowerShell, then everything seems to work just fine. So I'm going to use the PowerShell commands here just to make my demo go a little smoother. And you're going to notice that it's got everything here. It's got a couple little spots where it's going to want me to replace things with passwords. So let me just put in my super duper top secret password onto each spot where it says replace. And make sure I've got that one as well. There we go. And let me go ahead and do an edit and select all, and an edit and a copy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just minimize that to get that out of my way. I'm going to go to my Start menu, and you'll notice that I've got a Workflow Manager PowerShell. So I'm just going to click that, and let's just right-click, edit, and paste. And we'll just give that a few moments here. And just like that, I now have my workflow services installed. Now, the big thing about this wizard is that it is going to automatically generate a certificate for me. And in my case, I wanted to use the certificate that we issued from our domain certificate authority. So what I'm going to need to do is go into IIS, and under App Server, and under Sites, you're going to notice that there is my workflow management site. Over on the far right side, I'm going to click Bindings. There's the entry. You'll notice that by default it puts it on the port 12290, and that's just fine. And then I'm going to click Edit. And down below on the certificate, I'm going to click Select. And this will give me a bigger window that I can then use to grab my certificate. And the one that I'm going to want, if I scroll over to the right-hand side, is the one that was issued by, in my case, because the name of my domain is Geek Trainer, by the Geek Trainer Certificate Authority. So that, in my case, is going to be that one right there. And this is where I really kind of like opening up that select window. Makes it much easier for me to go grab the certificate that I'm looking for. So I'm going to choose my app server here, and I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to hit Close. So now I've got the app server set up. Now it's time to turn our attention to the SharePoint server. Let's kick back over to our SharePoint server, create the connection to our manager, and take a look at how to test to make sure that everything is working. So I'm going to start off by going to the Start menu, launching Central Administration, and I'm going to say Register, SP Workflow Service, specify the site collection that I'm going to use, which in my case is https://intranet 2013 geektrainer.com. My workflow host URI, a little bit of tab magic there, is going to be https://appserver.geektrainer.com:12290. And I'm going to go ahead and give this a name of intranet. Give that just a couple of seconds. And now, let's go ahead and fire up SharePoint Designer here. And create a very basic workflow for our intranet site. Now, don't worry too much about the particulars of getting in, setting up a workflow. Really just using this to test our environment. So I'm just going to hit the little list workflow here, and I'm going to choose Documents. And we'll just give this a name of Demo Workflow. And down at the very bottom here, you're going to notice the platform type. SharePoint 2010 is going to be the old style workflows, where I don't need to do any of that back-end setup. SharePoint 23 workflow is where I'm now going to be able to offload that to that workflow services server that we just created. So I'm going to go with 2013, and I'm going to hit OK. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have this write out to the event log, or to the workflow log rather, just to let us know that it completed. And I can do that actually just by typing in whatever it is that I might want. So in my case, I'm going to say log, hit a carriage return. It's log, it's log, it's such a wonderful toy. I'm going to go to my message, and I'm just going to type out workflow completed, hit enter, and then down here on the transition stage, this is going to complete my workflow. I'm just going to go under action and go to stage and end of workflow. There we go. And so now let me publish that, which will actually put that into SharePoint for me. And now let's test our workflow. So I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to go back to our intranet site. And now over here on our little demo document, I'm going to hit my ellipse, and I'm going to hit the second ellipse, and I'm going to go to workflows. You'll notice, by the way, on the little fly out there that it's trying to open that up inside the Excel web app, which is exactly what we set up earlier. I always like that. And now I'm going to go to my demo workflow. And what I'm now going to do is hit my little ellipse, drill back into my workflows. When we go back into our workflow screen, what we're going to see is that our workflow is now completed. What we're also going to see is that if I click on Demo Workflow, that you'll notice down below, inside the workflow history, the description, workflow completed, that's exactly what we told our workflow to write out. So what we've done here is we've now set up our workflow services and confirmed that it works. There is our external SharePoint services. I'll see you in the next lesson.